Hey guys, Tyler Hansman here with Tyleranzmannperformance. So, where does static stretching fit into a high performance training program? So I think the first thing we need to ask ourselves is, what are we hoping to accomplish with static stretching, right? I think a lot of people have in mind they want to increase range of motion. Okay, but for what purpose, right? Are you expecting that by increasing this range of motion, then we're going to increase power output? Because for a lot of different reasons, we know that not necessarily to be the case, right? It can be beneficial when we're talking about guys with extremely limited ranges of motion, to enhance that to some degree, to be able to apply force over a greater range of motion or something along those lines, especially when we're talking about maybe the shoulder, the pec, areas like that where we're restricted and we really need that to be able to accelerate the increased range of motion. But in general, static stretching does not make great use of our time, right? There are better ways to spend our time than static stretching, and here's why. So static stretching may temporarily add range of motion, right? But it's largely neurological, and it also tends to inhibit performance, right? And this may not be a huge amount. So there's some research out there by a group led by Shabin, and what their research suggests is that it's really dose dependent, okay? So if we're stretching for less than 60 seconds at a time, and maybe it's a single bout per body region, we're probably only gonna see a 1 to 2% reduction in performance. And that may seem really small, but when we're talking about elite sports, that's a big difference, right? If we're talking about throwing velocity, just think about what that means to you. That's pretty significant in terms of the performance effect it's gonna have, both in the game and what opportunities it's gonna lead to beyond whatever level you're at currently, okay? So, and then further than that, if we're stretching for longer than 60 seconds and we're using repeated bouts, the performance decrements seem to be even greater, right? So we really if we're gonna use it at all, we want it to be limited, and we probably don't want to use it before we're pitching or training. So static stretching seems to kind of dampen the neurological response when it comes to kind of power output, right? It reduces the sensitivity of the muscle spindles, so that in turn reduces the effectiveness and the power of the stretch shortening cycle, right? Which we really want to take advantage of when we're talking about power-based movements, right? So for pretty much any sport, if we're inhibiting the stretch shortening cycle in any way, it's probably not a method we want to use, okay? So instead of static stretching, what do we use instead? Well, I think there's quite a few options here, right? So one would be if we truly have a shortened muscle, which we don't always necessarily have. A lot of times what we're getting is kind of a protective mechanism around that joint because there may be problems elsewhere, okay? But if we truly have a shortened muscle, then what we may need to do is eccentrics, because that will actually add sarcomeres in series. So it will functionally lengthen that muscle, right? It's actually getting longer. Whereas static stretching, like we talked about, it's really a neurological effect where you temporarily gain range of motion. We're not really affecting those muscle fibers in any way. Eccentrics will actually lengthen them. So that's one way, all right, if we truly have a shortened muscle fiber. The other way would be isometrics. So these can be a couple of different ways. So we could do long duration isometric holds, right, where we'll get more compliance through that tendon, because that could also be an issue if the tendon's too stiff, right? We could see issues there. So we maybe want to do some long duration isometrics to actually add compliance there. We also may want to do end range isometric holds, right? So something like a prone external rotation hold if we're limited through glenohumeral external rotation. That may be something, because then we're actually adding strength to that end range of motion, right? Because if we're just gaining passive range of motion like we may through static stretching, we can't truly control those end ranges, right? And if we can't apply force at those end ranges, then we're really not doing a whole lot of good, right? We've talked in the past about length-tension relationships, right? So if we're out of the range of where we can apply maximal force, we're not really going to see any velocity enhancements, right? So it's non-functional range of motion gain, and it may just be setting us up for a greater injury risk as well. All right, so static stretching, in my opinion, and based on the research, really doesn't have a major place in a high-performance training program. We have a lot of better options in other training methods we can use, like eccentrics, isometrics, end-range isometric holds, oscillating isometrics at an end range, things like that will actually kind of enhance our strength at end ranges, allow us to apply force over a longer range of motion if that's truly what we're after, and won't increase our injury risk like static stretching may in some cases.